Hi, welcome to Just in Canada and our continuing series on Canada's social changemakers. My name is Justin Douglas, and today I'm here with Jessica Dolan. Jessica is an American by birth, but she's been living and studying in Canada for quite some time now. She's doing her Ph.D. in Anthropology at McGill University. She is an educator, a public speaker, and a published author. So her areas of expertise lie in the relationship between human beings and the natural world. So thanks for being here today, Jess.
Thank you for having me.
So today's topic is going to be a little bit about the environment and environmentalism. So to start our conversation, why don't you give us just a bit of an overview of your research and what it is exactly that you're working on?
My career focuses on studying traditional ecological knowledge for the purpose of protecting and regenerating biocultural diversity, and also on advocating and educating for Indigenous sovereignty and human rights and peace.
Well, you started in the United States, you ended up in Canada. What was sort of the process that brought you here, and what sort of interested you about the Canadian experience?
I decided to come to Canada to work with First Nations because it's the place to come for that. Over the last 6 years, I decided to research Haudenosaunee environmental knowledge. The Haudenosaunee are the Iroquois Confederacy, which consists of the Six Nations, the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, Senecas, and Tuscaroras. My research shows that Haudenosaunee environmental knowledge is indeed a distinct knowledge system and value system, and that's critical to the Haudenosaunee, and that it's also invaluable for the rest of the world to try to understand. And then also my role as a non-native researching the subject, I've found that, and I believe demonstrated that if someone like myself who's committed can understand such a depth of their culture and values and Indigenous law, then people who are decision makers, like public servants and politicians and leaders and developers, can also endeavor to understand it and respect Haudenosaunee sovereignty. So I've been incredibly fortunate. I've had what I consider to be the best teachers across the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and also at McGill University.
What's it like? Maybe you could just help educate Canadians a little bit more, because a lot of the territory falls between the United States and Canada. So there's actually more than one country involved in all of these sort of big issues that are going on. Maybe can you just talk about that a little bit?
Okay, so there's a professor named Dan Longboat at Trent University who is Haudenosaunee from Six Nations of the Grand River. And he describes all of the Haudenosaunee communities, or in Canada people call them reserves, and in the US people call them reservations. He describes them like an archipelago, which is like an island chain of territories, which constantly, people are related in the different communities, and they are situated in Quebec, Ontario, New York State, and then there's also some out in Wisconsin and Oklahoma. All of these communities are not isolated, but in fact connected with communication and relatives and movement and visiting, and yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
So how does that, because it brings up all these sort of issues of, like, when we talk about trying to protect the environment or work with Indigenous communities, all of a sudden you're dealing with like Quebec, Canada, the state in the United States, the country of the United States. So it creates all of these jurisdictional issues, which is not necessarily your particular background or research area, but I imagine it complicates things when you're trying to work within a community, having all of these other jurisdictional effects.
For sure. The Mohawk community of Akwesasne is often cited as a perfect example of this, because and there's other people who are more qualified to speak to this than I am, but they are located in Ontario, Quebec, and New York State on either side of the St. Lawrence River and islands in between. So that's an example of that. However, I think when people are trying to learn about this stuff, it's important to consider the differences between Canadian Aboriginal law, American federal Indian law, and the state laws international convention like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, as well as the indigenous laws themselves. And for the Haudenosaunee, they have their indigenous law that's still functioning and in all of their communities.
Let's switch the conversation a little bit more just to environmentalism in general, and sort of what are some of your impressions right now about the state of environmental protection in Canada?
Well, there's some big issues that are Canada specific as well as international issues. I'd say that some of the biggest ones that Canada faces are climate change with the melting of the ice in the north, fresh water with the removal of protection on many of the fresh waterways in Canada, and there's so much fresh water in Canada. Waste management and remediation in terms of human waste, but also waste from industrial activities. The oil sands, I think, is one of the biggest issues that it synthesizes and crystallizes many issues, but it really, really points toward the boreal forest and the importance of the boreal forest and the importance of protecting the boreal forest, which is a tremendous carbon sink that's important not only for Canada and North America, but for the world.
Maybe for Canadians who don't know about the boreal forest, could you just give them a little bit more?
Okay, I wish I knew the geographic coordinates,
No,
but the
it's
boreal
okay.
forest is one of the largest forests in the world, and it's located beneath the tundra and across Canada, and it is huge. And when we think about Canada, the majority of the population is clustered right by the border to the US, and then above that you have the boreal forest. And boreal forest, it creates oxygen because of its vastness and all of the trees, and then it also sequesters carbon in the ground, in the sphagnum moss and all of that. So with the oil sands, with the clear cutting of all of that moss and trees, you're releasing the carbon into the atmosphere that the forest naturally protects due to its own ecology. So to me, that is a tremendous issue for the whole world, because the boreal forest is protecting our climate just as much as the Amazon is. It's very important.
I don't think most Canadians are aware of that statistic at all, and I have to admit my own ignorance on this, because I didn't know that it was equivalent to the Amazon rainforest, and that's something that we as Canadians should know about and want to protect. So I think a lot of times Canadian mainstream media sort of makes this dichotomy between either the economy and fossil fuels or environmental protection, and it's usually one or the other, but not both. Are there ways that we can maybe get past that narrative? Are there ways that we can protect our environment and still be an economically progressive, functioning economy?
It's a big question, and I think it's an exciting one, because in terms of balancing economy and environment, we're at a very exciting time. And to me, this is especially interesting because I believe that movements of Indigenous peoples have brought this issue to the forefront. And we're now moving into a time that scholars and scientists and many people are calling the Anthropocene. We've moved out of the Holocene and into the Anthropocene.
Okay, you're gonna have to explain that to me
And
for us non-anthropological type of people.
The Anthropocene is characterized as an epoch wherein humans have unprecedented impact on the environment. We are now the dominant species on the Earth. And, but what's exciting about that is how broad-based that awareness is. And then also what's happened over the past, I'd say, well, what was Kenneth Deere talking about? Probably 30 years, is that Indigenous peoples have brought to global attention the interconnection between economy and environment. So a core Indigenous value is that humans are located within the environment. We're completely dependent upon the environment. Our economy is completely dependent upon the natural world, and that we should live within our means. And they themselves are looking to their traditional values to innovate sustainable solutions for living within our means in the natural world. So I think it's a time when we can look to indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge to provide some of the answers that we seek about how to balance economy and environment. We've gotten to a point where we realize that the economy is not separate from the environment, and that's been one of the major kickers of, I guess you could call it, capitalist economy, is that it envisions the economy as separate from the environment. But over here we have indigenous peoples and environmentalists and scientists and educators saying, wait, no, the environment is our economy, it is our home, and we have to respect that and be thankful for it and try to figure out how to live within our means.
Especially as we continue to see climate change and these extreme weather patterns happening in our own backyard, I think it's finally the wake-up call that maybe will help to get some action to change. But we'll move into a little bit of your experience living and working with the Six Nations. You spent some time in Grand River, Ontario?
Yep, Six Nations of the Grand River is where I started my doctoral research. I was based at the Six Nations Polytechnic, and Rick Hill hosted me. I got band council clearance, and I also sought, I went through an ethics process with the traditional, the Akwesasne Task Force on the Environment.
So you've written a lot of published articles, but one of the ones was for the International Society of Ethnobiology, where you identify and write about the Great Law of Peace. What is that, and can you tell us a little bit more about it?
I can begin to. I'm not the ideal person to talk about it. However, I can say that the Great Law of Peace is the indigenous law and value system and way of life of the Haudenosaunee, and it instructs people on how to live in peace and balance with each other and with the natural world. It also is a system of governance that actually the US founding fathers drew off of to frame the American Constitution. And I mean, there's so much written about it, and so much could be written about how it can inform Canadian realities and American realities and global realities, that I think I just want to leave it at that, but it is a tremendously important philosophy and very worth studying.
What is the dish with one spoon philosophy?
That's a value that is in the Great Law of Peace, and people describe it as, sometimes describe it as a treaty that was made between Indigenous nations before Europeans arrived here. And this dish with one spoon, the values of it are encoded in wampum. Wampum are belts made out of quahog shells that are mnemonics for the oral tradition and oral history of the Haudenosaunee. It's about the interconnection between peace, economy, and environment. And it essentially says that for people to live in balance with each other in the natural world and in peace, sharing within means is necessary. So in the belt you have the dish, which symbolizes the sustenance that the natural world provides, and then you have the spoon, which is shared amongst peoples. And the spoon, it's a spoon because, and not a knife or a fork, to emphasize the peace part, because if it were a knife or a fork, then people might be struggling over resources and territory. So I think this attention to the balance between economy and environment and living in health and peace is it's one of the values of the Haudenosaunee that's very appealing to the mainstream and to environmentalists.
It's appealing to me. Let's talk about the Canadian-American relations a little bit, specifically when it comes to environmentalism. Why do you think that North America is so obsessed with fossil fuels? But just how do we move past these old narratives, and especially when it comes to American-Canadian relations, because our economies are so dependent on each other, and we can't move forward in environmental protection unless both countries are on board. But it seems like there's still this obsession with milking fossil fuels till the very end.
Two thoughts come to mind when you ask me this. One of them is that, again, we can look to Indigenous values and I didn't mention these earlier, but part of what I've learned about Haudenosaunee governance is the emphasis on intergenerational thinking. A lot of people have heard of the 7 generations. There's even an environmentally sustainable cleaning product company called 7 Generations that's based on the philosophy of Haudenosaunee. And more importantly, that's the part of their governance is to consider any decision that they're going to make. They try to consider its effects on 7 generations. And so in there you have conservation, and then you also have the precautionary principle, because you're trying to consider how decisions you make now are going to affect people and the environment and generations to come. And that stands in stark contrast with sort of aggressive or speculative capitalist development, which usually operates under a very quick deadline, and it's like hurry up and get as much as possible, and imagines itself within limitless growth. A robust economy within a capitalist framework is not robust unless it's growing. So if it's just staying the same and sustaining everyone at a pretty good level, it's not defined as a healthy economy. So that's the first thing. And the second thing about Canadians and Americans is that what I've noticed in America, in the US, is that most Americans don't think beyond US borders, and certainly not with Canada. Most Americans don't realize the extent to which we depend on Canadian resources. Canadian oil, hydroelectricity, gold, timber, all of the whole north of Canada is like, on a cynical day, I'll call it a resource Walmart for the US and for other parts of the world. And the US has a tremendous population, like 300 million, I guess, and then Canada is, I think, approximately 50 million.
37?
37. So there's a big contrast in need there. And what Canadians and Americans need to do, and we could say, take a tip from Indigenous people in North America and think ecologically and beyond borders, so that we can envision ourselves all as a North American community with responsibilities toward protecting the health and safety of each other and of the environment for our children and our grandchildren.
Right.
And for other species. So I guess the short answer is to think beyond borders and try to think more ecologically.
We're moving up into an election, and I know that you are not by any means a political scientist or very familiar necessarily with the ins and outs of the Canadian system. But as we head to the polls, what are your hopes and aspirations for the kinds of conversations that we're going to be having around environmentalism?
One of the things that I have observed about Canada, in contrast sometimes with my experience in the US, is the agency with that Canadians feel and responsibility toward their political process. And I would emphasize that it's really important that Canadians, and especially young Canadians, get involved and stick to it in the political process. I think I'd also have an attention to corruption, like all North Americans do with our governments, but also to just keep up the confidence for their ability to make a difference within the political system. As well, I think access to higher education for everyone is very important. We need educated citizenries in Canada and the US. The young people are the future leaders and the future citizens of Canada and the US, and so we need to be able to have time and access to education to be able to make good decisions and become good leaders. So an educated citizenry is critical for the health and for the environmental health of Canada.
I agree. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens. This whole conversation is really meant to be an introduction to people about environmental topics and some of the important things to consider. So thank you so much for being here today. I think that in the future, hopefully we'll have a lot more to talk about, and I'm sure you'll be back again as a contributing guest on some of our roundtables, which I really look forward to. But in the meantime, thank you so much for being here today, and hopefully Canadians will have a lot more to think about over the next little while.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Justin.
Thanks.